There's a peculiar phenomenon that quietly governs most human interactions, yet remains almost completely invisible to those caught within its grip. The relentless urge to justify your existence. Every mood shift requires an explanation. Every boundary needs a dissertation. Every choice demands a defense attorney's closing argument. On the surface, this seems reasonable, even admirable. After all, explaining yourself appears considerate, transparent, emotionally intelligent. But Carl Gustav Jung, the father of analytical psychology, saw through this facade with startling clarity. He recognized that behind every compulsive explanation lies a fundamental betrayal of the self. A silent scream that says, "I can only exist if you approve." This isn't communication. It's psychological surrender. And Jung understood that until you stop this pattern, you'll never truly know who you are. This video will dismantle everything you think you know about self-expression and human connection. Because when Jung spoke about the need to stop explaining yourself, he wasn't advocating for rudeness or disconnection. He was pointing towards something far more profound, the emergence of authentic selfhood. The person who constantly explains themselves is unconsciously asking for permission to be human. The person who has learned to remain silent when silence serves them has discovered something revolutionary: internal authority. And when that authority awakens, everything changes. Your relationships transform. Your professional presence shifts. Even strangers begin responding to you differently. Today, we'll explore why the most powerful thing you can do is learn when to say nothing at all. And why, according to Jung, this single shift might be the key to everything you've been seeking. And first part is the hidden psychology of over-explanation. Jung's insight into compulsive self-explanation emerged from his deep study of the human psyche's relationship with external authority. He observed that most people live in a state of what he called psychological colonization, where the internal landscape has been occupied by the voices, expectations, and judgments of others. The person who constantly explains themselves has, unconsciously, internalized a brutal message: my experience only has value when it's understood and approved by someone else. This pattern usually begins in childhood, in environments where emotional expression was met with dismissal, correction, or conditional acceptance. You're being too sensitive. That's not a good reason to be upset. Stop being so dramatic. The child learns that their inner world is somehow defective, requiring constant translation into terms others can accept. They develop what Jung called a false persona, a mask designed not to express authentic self, but to generate approval. Over time, this becomes so automatic that the adult doesn't even realize they're doing it. They justify their sadness, explain their boundaries, rationalize their instincts, and defend their preferences as if each emotion required a court trial to be deemed legitimate. But here's what Jung understood that most miss. Every explanation you give from this wounded place actually reinforces your own powerlessness. You're unconsciously saying, "I don't trust my own experience enough to let it stand on its own." This creates a psychological prison where your self-worth becomes dependent on other people's comprehension. You can't feel angry without a good reason. You can't say no without an elaborate justification. You can't simply be without first proving you deserve to be. Jung saw this as a fundamental disconnection from what he called the self, not the ego, but the deeper center of psychological wholeness. When you're constantly explaining yourself, you're operating from the wounded ego, desperately seeking validation from the external world to feel real. The path to freedom, Jung realized, required a radical shift, learning to validate your own experience without needing anyone else's permission or understanding. But this shift isn't just intellectual, it requires confronting the deepest fear of all. What if I stop explaining myself and people reject me? Part 2. The fear beneath the explanations. Jung understood that compulsive self-explanation is driven by 3 primal fears that most people would rather die than consciously acknowledge. The fear of abandonment. If they don't understand me, they'll leave. The fear of misinterpretation. If I don't explain, They'll think the worst of me. The fear of existing without permission. Maybe I don't have the right to feel this way. These fears create what Jung termed the tyranny of the other, a psychological state where your internal reality becomes subject to external approval. You can't trust your own emotions until someone else validates them. You can't make decisions until you've built an airtight case for why they make sense. This is where most people get stuck. They think the solution is to become better at explaining, more articulate, more persuasive, more rational. But Jung saw through this completely. The problem isn't that you're explaining yourself poorly. The problem is that you're explaining yourself at all when explanation isn't necessary. Consider this. How often do you explain your happiness? When was the last time you felt compelled to justify feeling good, being excited, or enjoying something? Rarely, if ever. You only feel the urge to explain the experiences you've been conditioned to believe are somehow wrong or insufficient. Your anger needs justification because someone once told you anger was bad. Your boundaries require defense because someone once made you feel selfish for having them. Jung realized that this pattern keeps you trapped in childhood, constantly seeking the approval of internalized authority figures who may not even be alive anymore. The person who has transcended this pattern, Jung observed, has developed what he called psychological sovereignty, the ability to validate their own experience without external permission. This doesn't mean becoming closed off or dismissive of others. It means recognizing the difference between communication and justification. Communication shares information. Justification seeks permission. When you communicate, you're offering your truth as a gift. When you justify, you're putting your truth on trial. Part number 3. The power of conscious silence. Carl Jung believed that conscious silence, knowing when not to explain yourself, was one of the most sophisticated forms of self-respect a human being could develop. This isn't the silence of passive aggression or withdrawal. This is the silence of someone who has learned to trust their own experience so completely that they don't need external validation to feel real. Imagine this scenario. Someone questions your decision. Instead of launching into a detailed explanation of your reasoning, you simply say, "I've decided this works best for me," and then you stop talking. The discomfort you feel in that moment of silence? That's your wounded ego panicking, convinced that without explanation, you'll be rejected, misunderstood, or judged. But here is what Jung observed. When you can tolerate that discomfort without filling the silence with justification, something profound shifts in the dynamic. The other person can no longer position themselves as the judge of your choices. Your silence communicates something they may have never encountered before: complete self-authorization. This type of silence is magnetic because it's so rare. Most people are constantly seeking approval, constantly explaining, constantly justifying. When they encounter someone who doesn't need their understanding to feel confident in their choices, it creates what Jung called psychological fascination. You become harder to manipulate because manipulation requires reactivity. You become harder to control because control requires your participation in the dynamic of justification. People who are accustomed to having their questions answered with elaborate explanations suddenly find themselves dealing with someone who says, "I don't feel the need to discuss that further," and means it. This isn't rudeness, it's boundary setting at the highest level. Jung understood that this kind of silence requires tremendous internal strength because it means facing your deepest fear, existing without approval. But he also knew that this was the only path to authentic selfhood. When you stop explaining yourself unnecessarily, you stop outsourcing your self-worth. You begin operating from what Jung called the authority of the self, that deep center of wholeness that doesn't require external validation to know its own truth. If this resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue exploring these profound psychological insights that can genuinely transform how you move through the world. Part 4. The Alchemy of Non-Explanation. What Jung discovered through decades of working with patients, was that the moment someone stops compulsively explaining themselves, a kind of psychological alchemy begins to take place. The energy that was previously scattered in seeking approval suddenly becomes available for something far more powerful: self-actualization. Think about how much mental and emotional energy you spend crafting explanations, rehearsing conversations in your head, anticipating objections, building cases for why your feelings are valid or your choices are reasonable. Jung saw this as a massive drain on what he called libido, not sexual energy, but the fundamental life force that drives psychological growth. When you stop dissipating this energy in unnecessary explanations, it becomes available for creativity, intuition, and authentic self-expression. You stop living in reaction to imagined judgments and start living from your own center. This is when people begin to notice something different about you. You become less predictable, not because you're being contrary, but because you're no longer adapting yourself to meet others' expectations. Your no becomes cleaner. Your yes becomes more meaningful. Your presence carries weight because it's no longer diluted by the constant need to be understood. Jung observed that people in this state begin to attract different types of relationships. Those who were drawn to your availability for manipulation lose interest. Those who appreciate authenticity become magnetized to your energy. It's as if you've changed frequencies. Instead of broadcasting, "Please accept me," you begin emanating, "I accept myself." The difference is profound and immediately recognizable to others, even if they can't consciously articulate what has changed. But this transformation isn't just about external relationships. Something even more significant happens internally. When you stop explaining yourself to others, you also stop over-explaining yourself to yourself. You begin to trust your instincts without requiring elaborate internal justifications. You feel something, and instead of immediately questioning whether you have the right to feel it, you simply experience it. This is what Jung meant when he talked about psychological integration. The various parts of yourself stop being at war, stop requiring constant mediation and explanation to coexist. Part number 5, the ripple effect. Jung understood that personal transformation never happens in isolation. When one person begins operating from authentic self-authority, it inevitably impacts everyone around them. This happens because most social dynamics are based on predictable patterns of dominance and submission, explanation and judgment, seeking and withholding approval. When you remove yourself from these patterns by refusing to over-explain, you create what Jung called a disruption in the collective unconscious, a disturbance in the expected way things work. People who were used to your availability for their emotional processing suddenly find themselves having to do their own psychological work. Those who relied on your explanations to feel superior can no longer position themselves as your judge. Some relationships will strengthen through this process. These are connections based on genuine mutual respect and appreciation for who you actually are. But other relationships will become uncomfortable or even dissolve entirely. These are relationships that were built on your willingness to remain small, explainable, and controllable. Jung saw this sorting process as absolutely necessary for psychological health. He believed that carrying relationships that require you to betray yourself is one of the primary causes of neurosis and depression. The person who has learned to stop explaining themselves unnecessarily creates space only for connections that honor their authentic self. This isn't selfish, it's psychologically essential. But the ripple effect goes beyond just your immediate relationships. You begin to model something powerful for others, the possibility of existing without constant justification. People around you begin to notice that it's possible to state a preference without a dissertation, to set a boundary without an apology, to change your mind without a courtroom defense. Your example gives others permission to do the same, creating what Jung called a field of authentic possibility around you. This is why Jung believed that individual psychological work was ultimately collective work. When you heal your own compulsion to over-explain, you create more space for everyone around you to exist authentically. In sixth part, we have the practical transformation. So how does this actually work in daily life? Jung wasn't interested in abstract theories that couldn't be applied to real human experience. The shift from compulsive explanation to conscious communication begins with what he called the pause of awareness. Before automatically launching into justification mode, you pause and ask yourself, am I explaining because I want to communicate something useful? Or am I explaining because I'm seeking approval? If the honest answer is that you're seeking approval, Jung would say, that's the moment to practice silence. This might look like ending a conversation without explaining why you need to leave, saying, that doesn't work for me, without providing a list of reasons, changing plans, without offering a detailed justification for your decision, expressing a feeling without immediately rationalizing it. The discomfort you feel in these moments is what Jung called the anxiety of authenticity, the fear that arises when you stop living for others' approval. But he understood that this discomfort is temporary, while the freedom that comes from self-authorization is permanent. As you practice this, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to discover what you actually think and feel when it's not being filtered through the need for approval. You might realize you've been explaining away your intuition for years, rationalizing gut feelings that were actually trying to protect you, justifying staying in situations that were draining your life force. Jung observed that people who learn to stop over-explaining often go through a period of what feels like identity crisis. Who am I when I'm not performing for others? What do I actually want when I'm not trying to want what's expected of me? This temporary disorientation is actually a sign that the process is working. You're discovering the difference between who you've been conditioned to be and who you actually are. And as this authentic self emerges, your external world begins to rearrange itself to match your new internal authority. And last part, number 7, is the ultimate freedom. Jung believed that the ultimate goal of human psychological development was what he called individuation, becoming who you truly are, separate from collective expectations and conditioning. And he saw the ability to exist without constant explanation as one of the clearest markers that this process was occurring. The individuated person doesn't need to convince anyone of their worth, because their worth is not up for debate. They don't need to explain their choices because they're not seeking permission to make them. This isn't arrogance, it's integration. It's the deep knowing that you are the ultimate authority on your own experience. Jung understood that this level of self-authorization is actually a gift to everyone around you, because it frees them from the burden of having to understand or approve of everything you do. When you stop seeking their permission to exist, you also stop making them responsible for your emotional well-being. This creates healthier, more balanced relationships where people can be themselves rather than versions of themselves designed to manage your need for approval. The person who has transcended the compulsion to over-explain creates what Jung called psychological spaciousness around themselves. Others feel free to be authentic in their presence because they're not walking on eggshells, trying to avoid triggering defensive explanations. But perhaps most importantly, when you stop explaining yourself unnecessarily, you begin to hear yourself more clearly. The constant internal noise of justification quiets down, and you can access what Jung called the wisdom of the unconscious, your deepest knowing about what serves your highest good. This is when life stops feeling like something you have to defend and starts feeling like something you get to live. So let's wrap up all of this parts. And here's my question for you. What is the one explanation you find yourself giving over and over again, even though deep down, you know you don't owe it to anyone? Is it explaining your emotions? Justifying your boundaries? Defending your choices? Write it in the comments below. Sometimes naming the pattern is the first step toward transcending it. And if this exploration has shifted something for you, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more insights into the profound psychology of human transformation. The next video continues this journey into Jung's most powerful teachings about authentic selfhood. You won't want to miss it.